Well, good morning. My name is Justin. I'm the youth director here at Woodside, and I have the honor and privilege to share the message with us this morning on this Youth Sunday. And as this third Sunday of Lent, we look at the theme of failure. We're looking at Peter and Judas. I wanted to open with a story of one of the biggest failures I've experienced in my life. And I'll preface this by saying this failure is not particularly significant in the grand scheme of things, but it is a situation where the desired end result was not met whatsoever. Now, 2 years ago, my wife and I, we were expecting our third child, and when we were preparing for our first, we decided that we were going to keep the gender a secret. Not to ourselves, we don't like surprises, but we've heard other people like surprises, so for our friends, our families, we didn't tell a single other person. As we knew, her doctor knew, our dog knew, her English isn't great, we weren't worried about that getting out. But everybody else just found out when they came to the hospital to visit and when we called friends and family afterwards. For our second, we decided we'd switch things up a little bit. We would share the gender, but we'd do a little gender reveal with it. Nothing too crazy, no explosions, nothing that's going to make the news, but we'd have a family barbecue in our backyard, got a cake with, colored dyed cake, and the outside was generic, so as we cut in and lifted the cake up, you could see, if it's pink, it's a girl, blue, it's a boy. We already knew, again, we don't like surprises, but it was a surprise for everybody else. It was great. Good time. Now, for our third, anybody here who has 3 or more kids, you know that as it keeps going, you don't necessarily do the same thing every time, and we decided we were going to do something a little bit more understated. Now, it was winter, so backyard barbecue wasn't an option, but we thought we still wanted to have some fun with it, so we decided to make some gender reveal cake pops. We would make the cake and dye the cake either blue or pink, and then cover it in white chocolate. And then as we just saw family over the next week or so, we could bring out the cake pops and be like, oh, you can guess what the gender is, and then you take a bite of the cake pop and see if you're right? That was the plan. Now, I actually do a lot of cooking. I enjoy cooking. I try new recipes. Things generally work out when I do it. I also do some baking. I'm not foreign to the kitchen. I do spend time there. Haley as well. It's good in the kitchen. When we make things, it's usually quite edible. It usually works out. This was not one of those situations. Now, I have no idea what I was doing. I probably wasted $30 worth of white chocolate trying to melt it in a consistency that would nicely cover these cake pops so that you cannot see the cake underneath. My first try, I think we just ended up with this paste, just dry, impossible to even spread on anything, lump of white chocolate mess. The second time, it lit on fire in the microwave. The third time, and I think this was the final attempt, it was liquid, but it was not drizzly, or it was just like this lumpy, awful mess, and that was where we left it. We just sat there with some cake pops and a spoon and just looked like a lumpy, clearly pink cake pop with some amount of white chocolate on top. It didn't work out at all. When the next person we saw was Haley's sister. She came over to our apartment, and I'm like, hey, Taylor, so we made some gender reveal cake pops. You can guess the gender, and then I'll bring out the cake pop. You take a bite, and you can see what the gender is. Pull out the cake pop. It's obviously a girl, and we just laughed. The effort was definitely a failure. Now, failure is something we experience often, and we can even be mesmerized by it. You enjoyed hearing my story of failure. I enjoyed telling you the story of my failure. We can go on YouTube, search fail. You'll see many videos with millions of views. You could probably spend the better part of the afternoon just watching that and probably have a pretty good afternoon. We also have this desire to emphasize the failures of others as well, even though we know we're just as valuable as the next person. We fail in many situations in our lives. We fail at work. We fail in relationships. And we also fail in our walk with God. As a church, we've been going through the book of Luke, this account of Jesus' life put together by collection of first-hand sources. And this morning we're going to be looking at Luke 22. Luke 22 contains one of the most famous moments in the life of Jesus. It centers around the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is arrested. And we're not focusing on that specifically this morning. That's actually going to be next week. But what we also see in this chapter are very significant moments in the lives of two of Jesus' disciples. Moments where they fail quite significantly. And in these moments of failure, we see two different postures of their heart. We see two very different responses to being called out for what they're about to do. And we also see two very different responses in their lives as a result of these failures as well. You and I will approach many failures through our lives. Some will be funny, like a funny-looking cake pop. Others are moments where, there's a more meaningful end result if we, throw in the towel or if we push through to the other side. Life has no shortage of trials, no shortage of difficulties, no shortage of failures. So then the question isn't, will you experience failure, but what will you do about it? So as we look at these moments in the lives of Judas and Peter, let's look at how they navigated these failures while following Jesus. So we're going to start in Luke 22, 1-6. It's already read. I'm going to read it again. It says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people." And we'll pause there. So Passover is approaching. Religious leaders looking for a way to deal with Jesus. Jesus has been ministering, he's been teaching, he's been doing this in a way that challenges their authority, and they don't like that. So they want to get rid of Jesus, but that's not their only problem because Jesus is popular. He's well-liked at this time. He's got crowds who come around to hear him teach, and for them to just show up in the midst of a crowd when people are listening to him teach and share how to walk with God, that would not look good on them. They'd be clearly seen as the bad guys in that situation. So they wanted to catch Jesus when he's alone, when there isn't a crowd around, when there aren't people to make a scene. But this is not a simple task because they can't just go and search up his location on Snapchat or Find My Friends or something like that. They can't even have somebody just follow him around and see oh, he's alone now. Make a call, hey, come now, now's a good time. They actually have to plan this in advance. So they need somebody on the inside, somebody who would know Jesus' schedule, who would know when and where would be a good time, that Jesus will be relatively alone, that there won't be a crowd around him. So that's where we pick up in verse 3. "Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present." Now, Judas's memory lives on in infamy for this very moment. He's the disciple who betrays Jesus into the hands of the religious leaders, who then bring him to Pilate, who then sentences him to death on the cross. And I think since most of us know the story of the betrayal itself kind of loses its sting. But think about this. This is one of Jesus' closest friends, one of his followers. And yes, Jesus knows that he's eventually going to betray him. But he's still somebody who's been traveling with him for 3 years, ministering, teaching, learning from him. Judas learning from Jesus. He was a trusted member of the group. That Judas, we know from the Gospel of John, that he was actually in charge of the common purse. He kept the group's money. That he would have probably been seen with some level of importance. He was the treasurer of the disciples. from the other disciples' point of view, they didn't know that Judas was going to betray Jesus. When I see portrayals of the gospel in film, oftentimes there's a creative decision made to make Judas look kind of on the outs. He looks kind of sketchy, like you're watching it, you're like, yeah, we know what you're going to do. But when we think about practically, I'm sure looking back, some of the disciples had moments where they could look back and be like, oh, that was a little weird what Judas was doing here. Oh, he did say some strange things. But in the moment, they probably had no idea. I mean, you wouldn't let the kind of sketchy friend that you don't trust hold all the money for the group, right? It's some level of trust with the group. This would have been an absolute shock to the other disciples to know that Judas had betrayed Jesus. Now, we're going to go forward to our other disciple who experiences failure here. And this is in verse 31 to 34. We're going to look at what Peter did. So this is Jesus speaking. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. So, placing this in the gospel story here, Jesus and his disciples have just had the Passover meal. Jesus has just done the first communion. He's passed around the bread and the wine, and the disciples are sitting around the table after all of this. It's an important holiday. It's an important meal. Jesus has just done something very significant with communion. They might not fully understand it, but they know that there was weight to that. And the disciples decide to follow this up by having an argument about who's greatest. Now, it sounds kind of ridiculous, right? Like, what are they doing? They've just had this important moment, and now they're just going to start arguing. But when you think about it, is it really a family meal if there isn't an argument at some point at that gathering, right? Like, maybe it's politics, maybe it's sports, it could be politics and sports, but here it's just a good old-fashioned, I'm better than you kind of argument after this wonderful family meal. Now, when I spoke last year at Youth Sunday, the passage that I spoke from also was one of these moments where the disciples were having a who's better than who discussion. This is not the first time they do this. And in a way, we have this strange Youth Sunday series that is the disciples arguing about who's better. But Jesus then goes and he proceeds to tell them off. He's like, hey, if this is what you're talking about, if this is the conversation you're having, you are completely missing the point. And that is where this dialogue from Jesus comes out of. He has just addressed the whole group, and now he's turned his attention to Peter. Like, hey, you're all wrong, and Peter, you're extra wrong. Now, we don't know this for sure, but I imagine Peter had a pretty big role in this argument. I think there's evidence in the text to suggest this because he is directly addressed right here. But Jesus doesn't call him Peter here. We can see that he actually addresses him as Simon. Simon was Peter's birth name. When Jesus meets Simon Peter, he changes his name from Simon to Peter. We see this in Luke 6. We see it also in Matthew. We see it in Mark. And Peter means rock, but Simon means listening. In this moment, Peter has elevated himself in his own mind. He's built up this idea of himself in his mind that he's got some level of importance. He's taken it upon himself to argue with the disciples, other disciples about this, and Jesus has felt the need to specifically address him. And I think Jesus is using his birth name for 2 reasons here. One, the name literally means listen, right? Like, hey, Peter, listen. Listen. You actually need to hear what I'm telling you. I just told you guys you're missing the point here. You're not hearing it. You need to hear this. I think also to knock him back a bit, to take him off this pedestal. Like, yes, I've called you rock. Yes, I've called you to something greater. But remember who you are. Remember where you were before all of this. That maybe, being one of the closest followers of one of the most popular rabbis traveling around has gotten to his head a little bit. Hey, remember where you came from. This isn't about you. Then Jesus follows this up by saying, Satan has asked to sift them all as wheat. Now, I'm sure I'm not the most qualified person in the room to talk about sifting wheat, but just so we're on the same page for this line that I've definitely passed over and kind of missed the significance of before, sifting wheat is removing the grain of the wheat from the outer shell, the husk. And here, we have several analogies using wheat throughout Scripture, but here Jesus is saying Satan wants to break you apart. He wants to separate you. He wants to test you. And the way we sift wheat today is, by machine, as most things are done nowadays. But 2,000 years ago, it was obviously done differently. Back then, what they would have done is they'd have had to thrash the wheat, separating the wheat from the stalk and breaking the grain from the husk. But then they still had to separate those pieces. So it'd be picked up in a sift or a sieve, and it'd be shaken, mixed around, and the grain that's smaller and more dense would fall to the bottom, and the husk that's lighter and bigger would rest on the top. And whether it be the wind or just blowing on it, the husk would just float away, and you'd be left with the grain, the thing that you actually want. Now, this whole process probably got tiring if you're doing it for like hours and hours, but it was not considered a very difficult task. It was easy, it was uncomplicated. Just about anybody could do this thing. So to say, sift you as wheat, may have been like we might say, oh, it's not rocket science, or it's like stealing candy from a baby. That Peter has this idea of himself like, I'm so great, I can compare myself to others, I've got this. And Jesus is like, knocking you down, be like stealing candy from a baby. You're not as great as you think you are. Jesus is really trying to reintroduce some humility back into this group. But Peter still can't let it stay there. He's riled up, he's proud. So he responds to Jesus by saying, hey, I'd go to prison with you. I would die with you. And this is where Jesus, I just imagine he's just so frustrated at this point. He's just shaking his head like, Peter, you're not even going to make it through the day. Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny that you know me 3 times. Now we see the result of Judas' betrayal in Luke 22, 47 to 48, as Judas leads a group to Jesus, to the Garden of Gethsemane, to arrest him. We see Peter deny that he knows Jesus, just as he said he would, 3 times before the rooster crows in verses 55 to 62. And it says right after the 3rd time, Jesus looks directly at Peter. And Peter remembers what Jesus said. He leaves and he weeps bitterly. He's wrecked. I think we often see Peter's denial of Christ as his biggest failure, just as we see Judas' betrayal as his biggest failure. But these actions stem from something deeper. For Peter, it was pride that was his first sin. For Judas, it's his greed. When we look at both of these situations, we see something deeper than both of those things still. It's not just pride, it's just not greed, but it's the true common thing among all human wrongdoings. And that is putting other things before God in our lives. Breaking the first commandment that we see in Exodus 20, verse 3, that you shall have no other gods before me. We don't know Judas's motivation for his greed, but no matter what, it comes back to the same place. He's either serving money as his master, he's placed money as his God, that's his ultimate goal, and we see Again, in the Gospel of John, he shares with us that Judas had been stealing money from the common purse prior to betraying Jesus, that this wasn't the first time he had chosen money over God. Or he's lacking trust that God will provide for him, and he's going about it his own way, to be his own provider. Either way, he's either made money his God, he's made himself his God, maybe he's put them both in front. For Peter, this pride is not an isolated event. It happens several times. He really thinks that he can make his own way. Peter's a little bit sneakier, though, right? Because he's able to mask it with loyalty. He thinks that he's resilient enough. He thinks he's strong enough to do anything. That, hey, I would go to jail with you. I would die with you. He's placed himself in front of God in his mind. That his pride puts himself as the one who can achieve what he wants. Now, Jesus knows where this kind of thinking leads. He knows that it's dangerous. He knows that it's not going to lead to a good place. Peter might not even realize it yet at this point. For me, Peter gives a really oblivious energy about him. I don't think there's any maliciousness here. I just think he's missing the point again and again. But each of these disciples leave a very different legacy behind, despite their lowest moments being just a few hours apart. Peter goes on from this moment to be the first of the 12 to run to Jesus' tomb when he hears that the tomb is empty, that Jesus has risen. We see that he is distraught. He is wrecked when he realizes what he's done. He weeps bitterly, but he doesn't isolate himself. He doesn't stay in that place. He doesn't distance himself further from Jesus and the 12. Because Peter finally understood that it isn't about him. Out of his depth and relationship with Jesus, that he's able to put his trust in him, and that he doesn't just hear that the tomb is empty and say, oh, that's nice. He doesn't just walk to the tomb, but he runs there. He wants to get there first. He wants to see Jesus. And when we think about it, the last time he sees him, this is Jesus on trial, looking at him after having been denied 3 times. Easy to think that it'd be hard to face up against. That'd be a hard conversation to have. But no, he just wants to get there first. Judas, on the other hand, he's remembered for his failure. His name is synonymous with the word traitor. He was also distraught when he, realized what he had done, but his result was not one of trust in Jesus as Lord, but he went away. We don't see him with the disciples again after this point. He didn't know of the grace and the mercy of Jesus. Acts 1:18 tells us that Judas bought a field with his blood money. Maybe that was Judas's dream all along. Maybe that's what he always wanted. Maybe he wanted to gain enough money to be able to buy a field, to, grow some crops, to provide for a future family that he wants to have. Maybe that was the goal. Maybe that's why he was stealing money along the way. Maybe that's why he betrayed Jesus for money. Or maybe he was just in such a place of darkness, of purposelessness, of not knowing what to do, and he just thinks, I need to do something different than this. Let's distract myself. Let's get this field. Let's, pivot, do something else. Maybe he thought that's what could bring him out of this place of shame. But instead, that field that he bought with that money is where he died. Now, we fail every day. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's things that don't matter, like gender reveal cake pops. Sometimes it's bigger things that don't matter, like, you bump into a light pole with your car or make a bad investment. It costs you something. It's significant, but it's not a moral failure. But in our walk with Christ, we also fall short of his perfection. There's lies we tell ourselves and others. There's words we say in public and private. Thoughts we have. Things we know we shouldn't do, but we do them anyway. Things we know we should do, but we don't. But it's our response to this failure that's more important than the failure itself. Jesus isn't surprised when we mess up. He literally knew exactly what Peter and Judas were going to do before they did it. This doesn't mean he's happy about it, right? But our failure and inability to keep from failing is why Jesus died in the first place. We see in Romans 5, verse 8, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." That there isn't this expectation that we get to a certain place of good enough or close to perfection to earn the forgiveness of Christ, but that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That the whole point is we cannot meet that mark on our own. And the amazing thing is that we follow a God that never fails. While we fail so often, we follow a God who never fails. He never has, and he never will. Now, on one hand, that can be intimidating, right? Because if we put that on ourselves to measure up, to earn it, to be in that same place, we'll never get there. But the good news of the gospel is that that's not what is required. Something I've had to learn, a few times as I've been walking with Jesus, and I'm pretty confident I will continue to need to learn it again and again, is that in the moments when I feel most distant from God, when I feel like, what I've done, the pattern I'm stuck in, a place of complacency or a spiritual plateau, or maybe what feels like slipping back, all of these situations make me want to hide from God, to retreat, to cover myself, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. Hide from shame, hide because I know I'll just mess up again. What's the point? But these are the moments that I need to turn to God most. The biggest lie that you and me can believe is that there's a bad time to turn to God. That there's a bad time to open his word and hear from it, that there's that you're unworthy to enter into prayer, that you need to get a handle on a situation before you can talk to God, because that's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants us to believe that there's something keeping us from God. Now, I said measuring up isn't what we were asked to do, so then what is it that we're asked to do? I think Peter himself says it really well. These are Peter's words. They're written years later when he's wiser, he's more experienced, he's a pillar of the church, and he's writing to believers scattered around Eurasia, and this is what he has to say. He says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you." When we look where Peter was in Luke 22, these words carry so much weight. It's striking. Remember Peter's pride? Well, now he says, humble yourself. Remember how he tried to lift himself up, to make himself greater, comparing himself to the others? Well, now he says, under God's mighty hand, he will lift you up in his time. The stress and anxiety of failing, of not measuring up, that deep sorrow and shame of seeing the one he denied look him in the face after having denied him 3 times. Bring that to Jesus, because he cares for you more than you know. Recognizing that we can't just clench our fists and white knuckle our way through life. We can't just tighten our boots and put our heads down, lock in, focus enough to try to be enough. This recognizing a need for a Savior is a humbling thing. It takes humility. But it's also a freeing thing. It's freedom from inadequacy. It's freedom from shame. And that it's by Christ's sacrifice that we're lifted up by a God who loves us. He doesn't leave us there. If you're here this morning and you've been following Jesus for some time, maybe a lot of time, I'm sure you've had moments where you're just stuck in something and you're like, oh, I don't, like, how can I open my Bible and spend time with God right now? How can I approach him in prayer? How can I ask for forgiveness when I know this is something ongoing? I just feel like this is going to happen. Again, maybe you just had an argument that morning and you're like, well, the day's shot, maybe tomorrow. Maybe it's something longer lasting and goes on for months. And those are exactly the times to turn to God most. That's exactly the moment to spend time in his presence. That's exactly the moment to come to him in prayer, to lay it all out before him. Because he cares for you, he cares for me. He wants to lift us up in his time. Now, if you're here this morning and you haven't made a decision to follow Jesus, maybe you struggle with not feeling like you're enough. Maybe you are aware of your sin and the inability to escape it. This is an invitation, just like Peter, to put your trust in Jesus, in his redemption, his grace and mercy. That it's not for you to measure up, it's not for you to compare yourselves to others, but it's in the hands of a loving God that we can surrender ourselves. I invite you guys to stand with me. We're going to go into some worship, but I'm going to pray. God, thank you that even though we fail, you are a God who never fails. God, thank you that you lift us up, that it's by your hand that anything good happens in our lives, God. God, that in our weakness, you are strong, that in our darkest moments, we can experience your light and your salvation. God, would you go with us as we continue to look to the cross, continue to remember what you've done? Would you remind us of your salvation, of your grace, of your mercy extended to us? God, that it's not our own works, our own doing that saves us, but it's the work that you've already done. And we pray this in Jesus' name.